And get started, our faithful few that have lasted all throughout the day. I was speaking with Manoj earlier that we have the opportunity and the challenge of trying to think wisely about what we've heard today to try to synthesize some of the takeaways and to think about what's next. Let me go ahead and introduce the panelists that are here with me. And once again, my name is Samantha Custer. I work for AidData. I was one of the co-authors on the report that we presented today. I'm joined by Dr. Manoj Joshi, Distinguished Fellow from the Observer Research Foundation, the host for this wonderful event. Right next to him, Dr. Tanvi Madan, Senior Fellow and Director at the India Project at the Brookings Institution. And then last but not least, Dr. Swarnim Waglé, former Vice Chair of the National Planning Commission of the Government of Nepal. And so thanks to all three of you for being part of this important last panel of the day. And so what I thought I would do is have you reflect a little bit on what we've heard today. I wanted to pose a few questions to jog your thinking, but feel free to structure a few minutes of remarks just in response to those. And I thought it might be helpful to actually mirror this panel kind of off of the structure of the conclusion to the report. I and the AidData team had to really think hard about what did we think we learned from this exercise and where do we go from here, and I thought we could impose upon you to help us do the same. So a couple of questions to jog your thinking. I'd love to hear from your perspective, in what ways do you think that China's approach to public diplomacy is similar and particularly different to what you've observed of other foreign powers across the region, recognizing that when China is engaging in the region, it's not doing so in a vacuum, there are other players, and so what does that look like? Second, to what extent do you think that China's public diplomacy efforts at the end of the day have been successful in advancing its national interests, and why or why not? And then finally, taking a step back, how do you think that China's strategic competitors should view China's growing influence in South and Central Asia? Is this a zero-sum game, a positive sum game, or as one of the last panelists said, totally irrelevant to what other foreign powers are doing? So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Manoj, why don't we go to you first?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think when you look at the Chinese approach, I think what we learned, one of the important things we learned today is that we need to understand that from the political and governance point of view, China is a very different society from the society we live in. And the other societies that we have experienced with. For example, there was a question earlier about, the United States. So the United States had an active in USIS, USIA, USAID. So there was a certain public diplomacy component there. From my own experience as a journalist, when I was a student in the university, we studied from textbooks which were published, American textbooks, which got published because there was American money lying around in Indian banks. So it was enormous assistance to university students that these first-rate expensive textbooks could get published cheap in India. And so for a generation of students that was hugely helpful. The point I'm trying to make is that having gone through these, I'm sorry, what's happened is that my hearing aid is linked to my telephone and it rings. I need to get this off. Just a minute. No, I need to cancel the Bluetooth. Yeah, that's it. So, with the experience of, let us say, the old USIA, actually the experience we have had is that the US has reduced its public diplomacy presence dramatically. Just the other day, I was trying to get through a footnote of what is called Washington File, used to be called Washington File. I used to get that as a journalist. So you had all the statements, etc., of the US political leaders, etc., in one file. So that had a reference to Washington File. I couldn't find the archive. Now that's a huge tragedy for public diplomacy, because those are things that the US did, and it's a tragedy for research. Because if I'm looking for things that happened in 2000, in the year 2000, I can't find them. Now, to come to China now, that's the issue on hand, the style is completely different. Meaning the Chinese started off public diplomacy, let us say in a place like India, many of us who've dealt with them for a long, long time. It is basically through the friendship associations or political elements in this country who were openly for China. Many people, let's say what we call the Marxist-Leninist parties or the Maoist parties, so they would associate with them. So they would steer clear from everyone. Now you see a different pattern of engagement. You see a much more, and this is the interesting thing about the Chinese style, is, and they did, in my view, they do it across the board, is a huge capacity to imitate. Okay, you see, this is how the Americans are functioning, we must do this. So the United States had what's called the International Visitors Program. So, they would invite people over and then you see places, visit institutions, etc. The Chinese do the same. And they can be, I've visited military institutions in China. I've visited military formations in China because I have an interest in security areas. And they are aware of it, so every year they will take groups 3, 4. But where the Chinese have stepped up, the others have stepped back. So they have that advantage. When you're looking at the contemporary period, they have an ability to then get their point of view across. They have the ability, you may or may not accept that point of view, but at least you've, and I can say this as a journalist, you've actually physically been there. I've been, let us say, to the headquarters of the Southern Fleet of China in Zhanjiang, So I've seen the place, some sense of that. So it can't but affect my writing. I may not accept the Chinese line on various things, but the very fact that you go, you visit, you talk, it affects the texture of what you write. And I think those are things which are intangibles. Those are not things which you can easily capture. And that's what, it's another category. I wouldn't call it P2P because it's not truly P2P. It's actually professionals who are given a particular opportunity to travel to another country on these programs. And I see this, another area of imitation which I see is students. Now, for a variety of reasons, and it had to do with the quality of education in the US, the best and the brightest from India went to the United States. Okay? And the experience of the last, what should I say, 40 years, convinced the Chinese that there is a certain value in these students. Meaning, I've had the German ambassador tell me that I wish we had more Indian students in Germany. What did he mean by that? He meant that the best and the brightest of the Indians go there and then they enter the job market, the research institution, what has happened in the United States. But you see, of course, they are kind of exaggerating because they do not have systems through which, at least I'm not talking of the Trump era, but prior to the Trump era, where these students would go there, they would research and the best and brightest would be absorbed into US system. They would contribute to the development of US science and technology. So what do the Chinese do is that they started with scholarships. And I was quite astonished because I've had at least 2 or 3 interns in the Observer Research Foundation who have come to me and said, sir, I'm going to Shanghai. I said, what's happened? I've got a MA scholarship. So which is quite surprising that there's such a high volume, and I think the basic understanding, and I've met Indian students in Kunming, which is supposed to have some 10,000 students, they're medical students, etc. And Kunming in particular specializes in South Asia. You look at the Kunming's air traffic routes, you will see the flights that go from Kunming to Kolkata, Kunming, Kathmandu, Kunming to Dhaka. So it's a focus area. This is something which the Chinese have been working on for some time. Kunming itself, that area has been given the designation that you guys focus on South Asia. So the Chinese pattern, a much more organized, much more planned, and of course, when we look at them, is because the others have stepped back. Others have taken a step back because they found it either too expensive, or they probably found that, look, if we're going to get, meaning I was looking at airfares, I found that the New York airfare, Delhi, New York is far cheaper than Delhi, Athens, for example. It's just that the nature of the context has changed. I'll just stop here because I think we can have further discussion.
Yeah, I think that gives us some good food for thought. So just capturing 3 insights that I think I heard, and maybe we can ask Tanvi to build upon. So, you know, you were reflecting a little bit, I think, on how much is China imitating or mimicking what other actors are doing, but also are they putting their own spin on it in some way, or innovating by virtue of the particular society that they're working within that's very different than some of the Western democracies. And so does that put new opportunities on the table or take certain opportunities away? And also you were reflecting a little bit on perhaps there's a window of opportunity because there are fewer foreign powers that have as extensive public diplomacy programs. If there are fewer alternatives, that too creates opportunities. So maybe Tanvi, just asking you to build upon what Manoj shared.
Thank you, and I'd like to echo the thanks to AidData, to CSIS's China Power Project, to Asia Society Policy Institute, and to ORF as well. I think where something we heard today about kind of the similarities in China's approach, I think both in terms of objectives as well as the toolkit, there are some similarities. I mean, it's not new that countries seek, and great major powers seek to shape perceptions and even policies as they become more interested in certain regions or become more engaged in regions. I also think, and I think a couple of speakers earlier referred to it, in terms of the toolkit, China is not reinventing the wheel. It might be putting a certain spin to it, and I think Manoj said this as well. It is adapting or even copying things that other powers have used. I would argue that it's not even necessarily new in the China context. If you look at China during the Cold War, in particular periods in Africa, in India, and even in countries like Nepal, there were some elements of these. Of course, China didn't have the capacity. But if you go and look back at something like, for example, the Afro-Asian Conference and things like that, these were efforts to kind of shape narratives and shape preferences of various countries. But obviously, I think where the differences come, and you can't help but start at the scale, the scope, and the speed with which China is doing this. And I think one of the things the report reflects is how quickly this is ramped up. And I think that's one kind of major difference. I think the second major difference is something Ambassador Saran referred to, which is that China has built this narrative around, where I think a number of other countries have a lot of these programs. And in some cases, they might actually be more effective, but they're not packaged in terms or kind of perhaps directed so singularly in certain ways in terms of supporting certain policies as China is. And it's been also successful in getting a reaction and a response, not just in recipient countries, but among the other strategic competitors, as you term them. I think the visibility is also different. This is not new. I mean, this is something India is familiar with. The US, for example, during the Cold War, especially the first half, put in far more money into India in terms of economic assistance than the Soviets did. But the Soviets did the high visibility project. So there's this massive steel plant that you can point to, whereas other things like, debt restructuring, giving kind of aid to budget support, etc., not that kind of visible. I think in terms of toolkit, there's another set of differences, which is, I think, where what we're seeing is a much tighter link to the state in a number of different ways. Now, this is not to say, for example, in terms of the financial diplomacy, which I think is really where you point out is the kind of where most of the effort is going. I I think there you see a whole set of differences in the fact that this financial diplomacy itself is happening. That's different, especially in terms of infrastructure building. But also in terms of kind of how SOEs are being brought in. And India has some SOEs, but nothing to that scale. The US doesn't have SOEs for that matter, and so can't actually deploy that aspect, which it's discovering now as it thinks about what its development finance corporation with this kind of funds that it's going to do. But also if you think about other things, one of the things the report talks about is informational diplomacy using media. Again, China has the state-driven media that can connect with this. I think the other kind of difference I would say is scrutiny. The scrutiny that till recently China had been getting from countries, from recipient countries, wasn't as high as I think sometimes China was both given the benefit of the doubt, and I think the report says, and Danusha mentioned earlier today, that when there's a question of either questions about a project or its implementation or financing, the blame often is not to China, but it's to kind of the country's government, sometimes, many times rightfully so. But in the opposite case, if it was the US or India, they'd probably get blamed instead of their own government. And so I think to some extent, China's till very recently again, got away with a lack of transparency in its projects. And perhaps that's because it can also get away with that lack of transparency because there are not demands within China for there to be transparency. I'm just very quickly going to talk about, I think, outcomes, which is what your kind of conclusions. Is this working for China? And I think the report makes a good case that the results so far are mixed in terms of whether China is improving perceptions, whether it's getting foreign policy concessions and economic advantage. But let me just say a couple of things on each of those. In terms of foreign policy concessions or shaping views, I think it's important to look beyond what the report does, which I think the report acknowledges beyond kind of UNGA voting, how countries are voting. And I think we need to look at things that China cares about. Have countries changed their policies, or are they taking actions on certain issues or certain positions that they would not have taken otherwise, absent especially the financial diplomacy on issues like Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, South China Sea, voting at various organizations, including where China is seeking kind of leadership and these countries' votes might matter, but also support, are these countries supporting, for example, in international institutions, Chinese inserting language or standards, Belt and Road language and standards. And then I think, also thinking about, it's not just China's kind of public diplomacy shaping attitudes towards itself, but is it having the effect, and we might not know this answer for a while, in terms of essentially serving as a brake on other countries' interests or shaping influence? I think the opposite is also, we have to remember that it's true. These countries might be shaping or changing their policy, but China, as I think the report points out, has also backed a number of recipient countries when few others have, and I think the report gives the example on Sri Lanka. I think second, on economic advantage, again, we will only know this with time, which is, the report looks at in terms of the metric as trade balances. But if BRI is setting certain standards that whether digital, whether infrastructure, etc., which other countries, other major powers, but that becomes the standard, that is a long-term advantage that we can't judge now, but everybody else will either have to adapt to or be left out. I'll say this final thing on perceptions. I think it's really important. I think it is too soon to tell. I think the question is what will happen over time as things become clear. We've already seen a change over time. You see where there are a lot of infrastructure projects in Africa a number of years ago, you saw change. Chinese adapted. But also I think the questions over time to ask is, what is going to be the impact in terms of economic and environmental consequences of projects? And what will be the impact on perceptions? Second, what will be the asks that China makes over time? What will it do to ensure that these asks are met? including in terms of shaping political dispensations in countries. We've seen this in Africa, in Zimbabwe particularly, but we've seen in a number of the countries. And finally, what will China do when those asks are not met? It is when we get answers to those questions and it becomes clearer that I think you'll start to get a better sense of whether these things have actually worked over time.
Great, thank you so much, Tanvi. So just to reflect a little bit on some major takeaways that I heard, I think you continued the theme of talking a little bit about how China's unique position and its attributes as a society does shape the way not only that it approaches the tools, but perhaps how countries on the receiving end of those tools might view China, particularly with the scrutiny if there's a double standard there that China is given a pass because of the way that its society is structured. It's kind of an interesting question. I think you laid out quite well what the high stakes end question is, which is, in individual countries, in specific policy decisions, are policymakers changing the way that they think about their decisions, their options, and they're taking actions that they would not otherwise have taken? And how might this affect the broader views of their other foreign partners? And so, Swarnim, it strikes me that it's actually very nice that we have you going next on the end here. Certainly, I don't want to pigeonhole you in speaking about Nepal, but certainly with your time both inside of government and outside of government, and then your purview in Nepal, but then I know with your think tank thinking about South Asia, I wonder if you could reflect on some of these questions as well.
Thank you. I think I do agree with previous panelists on how these tools are not entirely new, right? They have been exercised by other powers and other countries before. But certainly, if there isn't much variation on the substance, there certainly is on the style. And I think Tanvi mentioned, I've also been struck by the scale, the intensity, and the efficiency with which many of these overtures are exercised, right? So it's almost a shock and awe kind of strategy being deployed. I mean, in the last 10 months, 30,000 Nepalis have gone to China. Officially, this came out in our largest daily a few weeks ago, and everybody thought that this is a very big number. Of course, these have to be normalized by your population size and all that. And I know you've, on the elite visits, in your report between 2000 and 2017, you've documented 114 visits by Nepali leaders, which is, if you divide it by 17 years, it's a lot. It's every high-level visit every 2 months. And if people have worked in government to really go through the motions of organizing these high-level visits, it's a lot of preparation, a lot of investment that goes in. I've been on a couple of these visits, and the amount of time, the number of people that are involved in organizing the logistics is just very impressive. Now, 77 such visits from the Maldives, for a country with 300,000 people or 400,000 people, that's a lot, right? So this shock and awe is really evident in the exercise of soft power. The elite-centered nature of these overtures, as is highlighted in your report, is really interesting. They woo officials, and they respond to requests made by politicians when it comes to project identification. And this is how you cultivate, state-to-state relationship. Mind you, this is not new, right? I mean, the US, I remember after 1990, when we opened up, Nepal became we abolished an absolute monarchy and made him a constitutional monarchy, and we restored multi-party democracy. The US was very, very active in taking our leaders to the US, and that worked. Many of the rabid communist leaders that came out of many years of underground very extreme rhetoric. Once they saw the US, once they visited the supermarkets and saw 20 different brands of bread and how little an average household spends on food, those little things completely change their mindset, right? So it works. These kind of elite visits really changes. The other thing that is very different is how these visits are almost a soft propaganda in nature, right? So it's very polite, very non-confrontational. I think somebody mentioned the word mutuality this morning. There's no mutuality there. It's a one-sided sort of soft propaganda at work, and there's no meaningful sort of bilateral discourse or dialogue, and certainly nothing bordering on dissent, right? So maybe there's something Confucian at work here. You know, you respect the hosts, you behave nicely as, you know, for the duration of the visits. So I think the shock and awe, the elite-centeredness, the polite, non-confrontational approach, and the emphasis on formal pleasantries. I think this is very different from, let's say, going to the US, right, where you can immediately, or Europe, where, you know, the discourse is much more frank, open, and all that. Now, to what extent China's diplomacy is successful in advancing its national interests, I think it's a mixed record, and a lot is yet to be seen. But certainly I noticed a slight departure in the Xi era from the Hu Jintao era, of course. Now, in the Hu Jintao era, I think China did succeed in conveying this benign version of a rising power, right? They use this phrase, peaceful rise. You know, it's a benign alternative to India if you're in South Asia, and benign alternative to the Western kind of views. So this contrasted with the usually preachy and domineering approach that the West was alleged to have held for decades, right? So the Chinese were very clear on saying, we don't preach values, we're only safeguarding our new national interests, we don't export revolutions, or we don't export ideologies, we don't micromanage your internal politics, we don't engage, we don't do regime change and all that. Those assertions are now coming under greater scrutiny and contestation in the Xi era. But certainly in the Hu era, if you ask common people, they say, yeah, Chinese are relative to the other powers that we're used to, they're much more benign. So on a relative scale, that was the case. They've been very successful in establishing red lines. So on issues of Taiwan, you know, nobody dares, you know, question the one China policy. The only remaining countries that recognize Taiwan are probably these tiny islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and, you know, a quirky few in Central America, right? They've basically rammed their views and, you know, turned everyone against, or you know, have forced everyone to toe the line. On Tibet, which is very salient for Nepal, again, you know, heavy clampdown on Tibetan activism. Although we host a large number of Tibetan refugees there, but any new arrivals, facilitation of new arrivals from Tibet, or any protests and dissent on the part of those who are already settled, it's, you know, the Nepali security apparatus, you know, cooperates 100% with the Chinese, and they in fact work together with the Chinese embassy in Kathmandu to make sure that none of this comes. I think one success that is also evident is in increasing business opportunities for Chinese entrepreneurs, Chinese firms, especially in the construction area. So they may not necessarily seek the support of the Chinese embassies, or they may not be guided overtly by the Chinese ministries in Beijing, but you do see these random Chinese companies building, let's say, a 30 apartment block, you know, for which the Chinese state did not necessarily show an interest. But they are openly, they have the capacity, they have the surplus resources which they can direct to these things. So I think, but having said that, it's not that they get what they want all the time, right? So there have been areas when countries, even in Nepal, the BRI was not approved for 12, 13 months. And I was in government at the time, and we questioned, we questioned the language, we questioned a lot of the provisions, like the principle of reciprocity in trade agreements. We questioned that. We're an LDC, we demand non-reciprocity. So the Chinese were bewildered at first because they were not used to that, right? But we convinced them that this is the global norm, the whole LDC discourse and all that, and they softened on that, right? On some of the other projects, they have been forced to soften their line, but the approach is different, right? It's not this idea of outright rejection is not welcomed. So you sit on it, you prolong it, and during the process you sort of tweak things so that 2 years later it's not as explosive as it was 2 years prior, right? So when the deal is done finally, there's no loss of face. I think these approaches are, I think, quite important. I can go on, but do you want me to?
Maybe we'll pause there for now. We'll come back around for another round. So, Swarnim, I think just reflecting a little bit on what you said, it strikes me that there's a theme there about some of the unique attributes of how China uses all of the tools, kind of looking across the board, this shock and awe strategy that you talked about, just the speed and the size of this, the elite-centered focus, the soft propaganda, the not being too preachy about the overtures, but still having your red lines. And I thought that the last point that you made was kind of interesting, almost reflecting that to a certain extent, aside from those red lines, everything's negotiable to a certain extent. And so that strikes me, you know, as I reflect, because as we shift from lessons learned to maybe where do we go from here, those unique attributes of China's approach to public diplomacy presumably creates opportunities and risks for countries. You know, there's opportunities for countries to negotiate if there's accountability and transparency, and there's also dangers that there will be negotiations that are not in a country's best interest. And so for this last round of questions before we open it up to the rest of the audience here, I wanted you to reflect a little bit on two or three questions. So first, how should countries maximize the upsides of Beijing's public diplomacy overtures while mitigating the risks of the downsides of this growing influence? Perhaps reflecting on the day and then also what you said here. It strikes me that there might be different roles that different segments of society might be able to play in this. So thinking a little bit about, well, what can the public do, the private sector, academia, civil society? Do these actors have different roles to play in terms of providing checks and balances for their countries in how they engage in Beijing? And then I think a nice, interesting question to really think about at the end would be, what should Beijing's strategic competitors do more, do less, and do differently if they want to maintain influence in the region? So maybe Manoj, we'll go over to you first.
Yeah, sure. You know, I think first of all, I think it's important to understand the difference that China's public diplomacy, the difference between Chinese public diplomacy and other public diplomacy. Because unless you have a grasp of that, unless you understand, you know, I think Bonnie pointed out that it's propaganda at one level, but just dressed up and called public diplomacy, okay? So if you have a clear understanding that this is what it's all about, this is about pushing Chinese interests relentlessly, virtually being almost immune to feedback. You see, if you want a particular, if you have a particular goal in mind, once you have an understanding of that, you can also respond by altering your strategy. In the sense, normal strategy with normal countries would be, okay, this is the point where we negotiate, okay? And negotiation often means that instead of 100%, I get 80% of my demands and you get 80% of your demands, and therefore both of us, you know, come out what the Chinese themselves called a win-win outcome, you see. But when the Chinese win-win outcome, the concept is different. Chinese means they win-win and the other guys could lose. So the point I'm trying to make is that once you have that, once you have grasped the fact that, so understanding what the Chinese goals are in a particular case is very important. Because sometimes there is a huge amount of deception that comes, you know, in that strategy, because since it is a centrally led, centrally driven strategy, since it's a weaponized strategy, as it were. So it's like tourism. I mean, say for everyone else, tourism is tourism, but for Chinese, it's weaponized. In the sense, they can tell one country that from here and after, no more tourists for you. You know. Now, this is something which that's why I'm trying to emphasize that it's very important to understand that China does things differently. China is different. And if it's different, then your the negotiation strategy that you use with other countries cannot be used there. You may have to use a completely alternate set of tools to deal with China. what they are, it's more difficult to say, because the thing is that because you are different kind of societies, and one is centrally led, centrally the policies are made in a centralized fashion, the other the more decentralized fashion, it becomes a bit complex to react. You can't be you cannot yourself become Chinese to deal with them. So that is one part of it. But I think at the same time it's important to engage with China. I think engagement is something which you don't have the option of saying that, look, we don't know what these guys are up to, so let's not engage with them at all. So I think whether it is the Belt and Road, whether it is anything, and I'm saying this with a very clear understanding of my disagreement with India's strategy on Belt and Road, which is to basically say Belt and Road, we don't agree with it and things like that. My view is that you should cherry pick Belt and Road. If a port is built in East Africa, any ship can go there. If there's an economic zone, the Chinese develop an economic zone, you can set up, you can invest there. I can understand a pipeline, because pipeline goes in one direction, or a railroad goes in one direction. I'm not talking of those, but there are a number of other areas where you can cherry pick what you can, and if the Chinese are willing to put in money for their reasons, there's no reason why you cannot latch on to it, make profit, your companies can make profit. So I think it's important to be pragmatic about it. To be pragmatic about it, say what can I get out of this? What can I get out of this? Be absolutely ruthlessly pragmatic in the way you deal with this. So I think from the point of view of responses to this, it's important that you engage, and it's important that you engage with, to use a cricket analogy, with front foot forward, in the sense go out and meet this instead of adopting a defensive strategy. A defensive strategy is when you say, no, I don't agree with Belt and Road, and then you sit tight. That's not good enough. You see? Now we are seeing, for example, the United States, which initially kind of dissed the Belt and Road, is kind of moving towards a strategy, the BUILD Act and the other measures that have been taken, but they are still very, very, what should I say, they're still in their first stages. You need much more cooperation, collaboration. I'm saying, we look at I commend here the pragmatism of the Japanese, who last year, agreed with China that we'll do 50 projects, Belt and Road projects with you. Now, which means that the Chinese have to take the Japanese with them, you see. And the Japanese, because they raised the flag, they use the code word quality infrastructure. And they keep on repeating it, that we are in for quality infrastructure. So basically what you're saying, telling the Chinese is that, guys, your infrastructure is not quality infrastructure, it's the Japanese who can help you with quality infrastructure. So what I'm trying to say is that it is important to play the game and not to sidestep. I don't think that option is there before any of the countries.
Great. So I think some good lessons learned and insights there. So you need an abnormal strategy for an abnormal actor. Really, it starts with understanding what China is trying to achieve and recognizing that it can turn public diplomacy tools or propaganda tools into a weaponized strategy to advance its interests. And then ultimately the lesson presumably for both countries on the receiving end of those overtures as well as China's strategic competitors is to not be reactive or defensive, but have an opportunistic strategy to get as much as they can out of BRI. So Tanvi, you want to build on that for us?
Sure. I think Manoj's point in terms of, how do you maximize upsides, which is, I think, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. As Ambassador Saran also said, if the infrastructure is essentially open source, whatever term you want to use, that it is not exclusive, and it is, it's something that is actually going to benefit the recipient countries that have said they wanted development financing, which a number of other institutions weren't providing. that it's for the good, that if a road's being built, after all, India, despite not signing up to BR, is using already some of the infrastructure that's been built under it. I think that's kind of maximizing the upside. It's a good thing in that sense. I think the other kind of way to maximize it is, one of the things I think the report reflects really well, but you've seen this in other areas outside South and Central Asia, is that the Chinese are learning and adapting. And so one of the things is how can strategic competitors, recipient countries, etc., push them to learn and adapt in a constructive way, but also hold them to account when they say they have learned. So a good example, and I think we've already seen some success in terms of the pushback. If you look at the Belt and Road Forum and the Chinese attitude and approach and the rhetoric in 2017 and 2019, there is a shift. Now, I would argue that it is a combination of pushback from recipient countries, but also from strategic competitors making this a big deal. So whether it was India releasing, not just saying we won't sign up to Belt and Road, but issuing a list of principles that infrastructure projects should meet. Then the EU doing the same thing, the Japanese doing the same thing, the US. This has, if for no other reason that China suddenly has competition and it has to worry about things, how these are being seen as the recipient country, that has an impact. Just a few things on what I think specifically recipient countries and strategic competitors can do. I think in recipient countries, one of the big things is getting smarter about China, what it's doing, what its intentions are, what it's doing in other parts of the world, and trying to kind of think about different scenarios that might. Now, when you're looking, I think one of the things the report makes very clear and very successfully is that these countries at the end of the day, the thing that's most attractive about China is that they see Chinese investment, they see China as being part of their own growth objectives. And so it's not like countries are going to say, we don't want this at all. But learning about what might come with that funding, which at the end of the day, maybe we shouldn't use the word funding because that suggests it's kind of a more grant. Also become clear about what this is in terms of money. So I think across the board, getting smarter about China. I think second is learning from others. And I don't mean kind of learning from strategic competitors. I think parallel learning, for example, a number of countries, the Kenyans have thought about Mombasa now in terms of Hambantota, but also countries in Africa where there have been Chinese investment for much longer can offer lessons to other parts. So for example, there's some kind of East African countries which have started putting in legislation that a certain percentage of employees have to be local for any projects. That's something that countries can learn from. I think also recipient countries have to, once they've learned kind of about the vulnerabilities, where they might be, is harden systems across the board to lessen that vulnerability, whether that is political system, economic system, civil society, media, private sector. Just a few examples. And this is not just recipient countries kind of as we think about developing world. I think the strategic competitors have learned that they too can be targets of this and need to harden their systems. Political funding, where's the money coming from for your election? Transparency in that regard. On the economic side, kind of getting better terms and transparency for kind of, better investment screening. But even things like the media and civil society getting smart and asking the right questions when somebody's offering you an exchange program. I'll give you an example of a media thing. One of India's leading newspapers published a op-ed by the Chinese ambassador here about Tibet. And it was labeled as his personal opinion. No Chinese ambassador is going to write an op-ed, which, a number of ambassadors from a number of countries write op-eds, but it's not a personal opinion. And second, you cannot label it, as this newspaper did, as analysis and not the view of the state. Getting smarter, and when I talked to the people at the newspaper, they said, oh, we didn't think twice about it. Well, they should. Every country, for example, should not be accepting supplements. That's true of the Washington Post, it's true of the newspapers here. These are the things that people need to think about in terms of what it is that they're doing. And then I would say the other kind of lesson for recipient countries is use major power competition. Use major power competition to get better terms from the Chinese, but from others as well. To demand transparency, and I think this is something publics have to do more than kind of outside countries, because that's always seen as somewhat loaded, and renegotiate terms. Because even, for all the differences of China, that China brings and are abnormal, the laws of physics apply to it too. Very quickly in terms of what strategic competitors can do, I think, to some extent, strategic competitors of, US, Europe, but I think especially countries like India in terms of South Asia, Russia in terms of Central Asia, they're always going to be seen with a certain jaded view by the neighbors, partly because they're the near power, they've been the regional hegemon. China's kind of that new, attractive, far power that doesn't seem like it's demanding too much, but that could change over time. I think the big thing the strategic competitors need to do is up their own game. Kind of offering alternatives. And I take Samir Saran's point that it's not just about kind of offering alternatives, people really want this, fair enough. But I do think offering, you have to, when you're saying to somebody, don't take this investment, what's the choice if they need it? I think second is things like, when I talked about the kind of get more knowledgeable about China, I think strategic competitors can play a role. I think we have to be careful about who plays a role where. India playing kind of, for example, helping with technical assistance in countries in its neighborhood will be seen with slightly kind of jaundiced eyes, saying, well, this is being done for a particular purpose. But, offering technical assistance so countries become smarter, both in terms of immediate kind of contracts. So we saw the US doing this with Myanmar and the deal for the port of Chokpyori development, but also institutional, which is building capacity over time. So countries, whether it's legal assistance, etc., technical assistance, countries don't have to depend on outsiders coming in. They have their own experts in town. I think another lesson to be learned from the Chinese perhaps, which is keep relationships with not just one party in a country, but keep it with not a regime, with a country. I think that will serve well over time. I think, exposing the downsides. I actually think for all the criticism that it's got, that has had an impact. But I think to some extent China does it themselves, whether it's in terms of their projects, but also let's see the recent example of Chinese diplomats, which was seen as very successful. They were getting on Twitter, they're writing, but now we've seen the edge turn a little. We're seeing kind of Chinese diplomats now not just talking about kind of the good stuff, but starting to kind of tell people in their own countries what they should be doing. That's not a bad thing. Let countries see what they're doing. And I think finally encouraging transparency for strategic competitors, but then they have to live up to those same terms, learn by example. I'll end by saying one thing that I think strategic competitors don't do well, which they should do, is I think the first rule should be do no harm, which means look at their own behavior. And so you cannot say to others that don't do this because the Chinese will economically coerce you, and then weaponize interdependence yourself. I think the example the report gives is very good in terms of India and the blockade of Nepal, and how that created an opportunity for the Chinese. That, to put it bluntly, is an own goal which can be avoided.
Great, thank you so much, Tanvi. A lot of good food for thought there. A couple of things that I took away from that, particularly, so China is learning, but how do we nudge them and push them along to learning constructively in ways that are beneficial for countries in the region? Similarly, for countries on the receiving end of China's overtures, how do you almost have a community of practice, so to speak, of learning from the pitfalls and what countries have gotten right? Using major power competition to your advantage, and then for strategic competitors, being mindful that as you are preaching, to other foreign powers that you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that, you should hold yourself to a similar account. I think that's great. Swarnim, I wonder if you could build upon this, and actually, rather cheekily, I will add this to your remit if you don't mind. But as I was hearing some of these recommendations, I found myself thinking about the big decision that Nepal has coming up about this railway investment that's been talked about quite a bit. And I've been asked a lot of questions about that. I think it's a really interesting case study of thinking through how a country has, what questions you need to ask, how you can actually turn that into an opportunity for greater leverage. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. On how strategic competitors, should view this rise of China or greater engagement of China, this as a zero-sum game. I do echo this view that there's a great hunger for development catch-up among the neighbors. I come from Nepal. Our per capita income is $1,000. We want to be $3,000 in 5 to 7 years, right? So who is going to fund? And at such levels of development, you need capital formation. Once you reach middle income status, then contract enforcement, intellectual property, rule of law, and all these things become much more pronounced. At this stage of development, you should pump your money way out of poverty. So capital formation, hard infrastructure, it's really important, right? So there's India cannot and has not been able to substitute or fill that vacuum in Sri Lanka or in Bangladesh or Nepal. So this is one reason why despite initial Indian reservations, all the South Asian countries except India and Bhutan, which is a special case, have enthusiastically signed up to the BRI, right? Hoping that a lot of this extra finance would be channeled to fund hard infrastructure, in which China has shown that it has a particular comparative advantage. So this has to be recognized, this hunger on the part of neighbors to really catch up fast, right? And the need, in Nepal we've done this assessment, we need 12% of our GDP every year just to keep up with the growing infrastructure demands. Forget the quality, forget how much of the unmet needs exist at the moment, number one. Number two, I think the strategic competitors, and that means India in South Asia, needs to recognize, and this was nicely put by Shyam Sarada, that a lot of the infrastructure that China is going to fund will be actually very valuable to India. You look at the position of Nepal, right? The east-west highway that we have, more than 1,000 kilometers, that was built 30, 40 years ago, with Indian assistance actually, could, with greater openness, serve your hinterlands north of the Ganges. Similarly, there's a very substantial transmission line, high voltage transmission line that's being built with American assistance for the first time, grant money, MCC money. So almost 300 kilometers of transmission line. That can be used to export clean energy from Nepal's hydropower generation to serve the growing demands in Nepal and displace dirty sources of fuel, right? Hambantota example came up today. Yes, people were upset. The Hambantota is being touted as this bad case, but half of the car exports that happen through Hambantota now are apparently Indian cars, right? So India is the one that's using Hambantota port. And geography is such that you can't get a go-ahead on many of these projects without Indian blessing. So again, I go back to hydropower. The CERC, the Indian Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, came up with these guidelines that says, if you want to export power to India, more than 50% of the investments must be Indian or through Indian companies. That meant no to Chinese investments, no to Western investments, but through. So that paralyzed many of the decision making for 3 to 4 years. That was revised once the Indians realized that was not to their advantage. So, Indians are not substituting or they're not filling the needed gap, but you can't substitute away India as well because the people-to-people ties are so thick, so dense. 6 out of 10 marriages that happen along the border are across the, involve the Indian states in Nepal. So this, you can never substitute that. The Bollywood, the linguistic links and all that. So I think I would urge our, the big powers in the region to really be less paranoid about these things while being mindful of, of what are the strategic, pursuits there. And on the part of the smaller countries, the receiving countries too, we need to respect the security concerns of countries like India. And this is where I think, if I were an Indian, I would also be paranoid to an extent if I saw that, unilateral projects were being pursued in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar and Bangladesh, and then the CPEC in Pakistan. That would definitely give rise to this feeling of encirclement, right? So there is an element that needs to be acknowledged. So I think there's this, there's a degree of bilateral trust that needs to be established, and almost a tacit understanding that, this is why I'm doing this project, and in the end, this is going to be good for you. And any hidden security interests, like if the ports are going to be used as a military base and things like that, those are the red lines that even neighboring countries should respect and honor, in my opinion. But the genuine development needs, I don't think the strategic competitors should be very very respectful of as well. Now on what are the things that they should do more and less? I think there's a nice north-south versus south-south template established in the area of trade, in the area of investment, and in the area of humanitarian aid. I think the strategic competitors, and this applies to EU and the US, the Western model, as well as in particular, to really look at where the south-south paradigms of trade, investment, and humanitarian assistance has evolved in a better manner than to the more established models of north-south aid, trade, and humanitarian assistance. I think from that we can glean a lot of lessons. I can elaborate this, but let me move on to another set of points. So a few lessons, the Western view has been, focus has, especially in the last 20 years, in newly democratizing countries like Nepal, has been on soft norm setting. I think we've exhausted that. The hunger is for hard infrastructure. That's why you see this swing. People are kind of, how many of the human rights sensitization workshops do you need funded through USAID or funded through the EU funds? Right? And people are really fed up, and and this is enough of these. Now we are mature enough to do these things on our own. In the early 90s, perhaps that had a value, but now it's they've hit diminishing returns. And yet the hunger is, as I said, on hard infrastructure, which the Americans through the MCC are beginning to fill, for example, and Indians have been doing this for a while as well through roads and electricity. There has to be a renewed focus on skills, entrepreneurship, and low cost augmentation of productivity, right? So here, the Western model has been focused on intellectual property rights, reciprocal trade, onerous bilateral investment treaties. We don't have an appetite for that anymore because the alternative are slightly different, right? But there are all these multilateral institutions that the West and other countries have built over the last 70 years. Use them to push some of your value systems, for example, microeconomic reforms, regulatory reforms that are more attuned to your kind of political dispensation can be pursued through them. The World Bank, has been doing that, and the Asian Development Bank, which is seen as a Japanese bank by the Chinese, has also been doing that, and use them rather than through the bilateral programs. I think there will be less resistance. The academic exchange and bureaucratic strengthening. I think these are projects that worked very well in the 1960s and the 70s. The Philippines used to train bureaucrats from India and Pakistan, because Philippines was a rising power after the Second World War in Asia. And we lamented about this elite-centered nature of Chinese support, right? But bureaucracies are extremely important at low levels of development, even at high levels of development, but they have significant value to add to the development process when countries are catching up fast. So I think the strategy competitors should focus on that. A lot of the shift away from these norm setting, softer programs to hard infrastructure, as well as civil service reforms, bureaucratic strengthening, and expanding academic freedom and sort of these educational programs. And I have something to say about this South-South model of humanitarian aid, because I led the post-disaster response in 2015 after this the earthquake. And what struck me was how agile India and China were in responding to the disasters compared to the more established, the aid agencies, multilateral aid agencies, and the European Union and the United States. It was very rapid, unconditional, agile, state-driven, and bulk assistance that came from China and India, as opposed to conditional, contracts-driven, fragmented, and NGO-led programs that had very high transaction costs that were being pushed by the US and other Western powers, right? So, these traditional responses are very slow and they follow a different kind of a budget cycle. whereas the new responses, the southern responses really made a difference. It saved lives, right? And in fact, funny thing happened 2 days ago when the American Assistant Secretary of Defense showed up in Kathmandu, and he was partly there to deliver 2 Sky trucks that were promised 5 years ago after the earthquake, right? So these things really matter. But my final point is, what should they do more that is positive is, really reinforce some of the universally agreed values through multilateralism, which I've already alluded to. So the triumph of openness, pluralism, the freedoms that we all cherish, peace, inclusion, human rights. You have 70 years of multilateralism to push those agendas through, right? Just finally on what are some of the upsides of the Beijing's. So BRI, I think we in Nepal are looking at this from multiple angles. Can we nudge some of the relocation of industries? I think this came up in the Central Asian case. The entire leather industry has moved to Ethiopia from China. Had I been in a decision-making position at the time, I would have tried very hard to woo at least 15% of the Chinese leather industry to move to Nepal, because what Ethiopia is offering, we can offer too, the LDC benefits and all that, right? Infrastructure can pay off handsomely for landlocked countries. This will diversify, lower our cost. The people-to-people links, especially tourism and digitization, I think is something that we must take advantage of. The concessional finance windows, of course, are very important, and the whole environmental facet associated with BRI. If they are covering 60% of the world, make sure that what they do is green and climate friendly, because the Himalayas, which Nepal associates itself with very deeply, supports the livelihoods of 2 billion people and all that, right? On what more we should be doing is scrutinize the costs, the financing and the project implementation modalities. And this is where, again, the strategic competitors do have a cleaner, better record. A lot of the Chinese projects, very untransparent. The costs are exaggerated. The exaggerated amount is all used to bribe off every single politician who might potentially oppose these projects in the end and all that, right? So I think greater project scrutiny. How much of what is the content of political appeasement? Is it just being done to appease a particular politician? That those kind of audits need to happen. Rule of law, corruption, the environmental concerns, and whether in the end these things end up strengthening institutions or not. It's very important. So I would ask very simple questions, right? Is a particular project needed? What development purposes will it serve? Is it affordable? Do we have the technology that is appropriate? And after the project is complete, do we have the human resources to actually run it, to manage it? I think these are very basic questions that we should be looking at. Now on the train question.
I might have to pause you there, Swarnim, but if we have time at the end, I definitely want to hear your answer on the train. I think you've given us a great rubric actually to take back and think about how to apply these questions to all new investment projects, which is a couple of things that you highlighted for us, I think. So strategic competitors really thinking about aligning their offerings with country priorities, using a kind of a package of civil service reform, academic freedom, and hard infrastructure as kind of being responsive to those things, thinking about the process of delivering assistance and thinking about agility, and then finally leveraging multilateralism to promote universal values that will be not only advantageous to countries but also to the strategic competitors themselves. So to make sure that